Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So inshallah ta'ala we'll continue in our light commentary on Kitab al-Siyam and Bulughul and Maram Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala. And we left off last week, Wednesday, with the hadith number 532. Actually, do me a favor, Akhi. Can you take those two books down, give one to the sisters, and then the brothers can have the other one. So hadith number 532, which is the hadith of Hafsa, al-Mu'mineen radiyallahu anha, أن النبي صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم قال من لم يبيت الصيام قبل الفجر فلا صيام له. So in this hadith, Hafsa radiallahu anha, she said, the Prophet said, no fasting is accepted from the one who does not commit his intention to fast before dawn. Some point of the night, the person has to commit himself, resolve himself, make the intention to fast. So this hadith and the coming hadith speak to the importance of niyyah in terms of as-siyam, in terms of fasting, and also when a person has to have the niyyah for fasting. So let me say at the outset that there is no fasting without a niyyah. There's no fasting without intent, without intention. So imagine if a person woke up for work, and it's usually his practice to have breakfast before going out to work, but he woke up late. And so consequently, there was no time for breakfast, and he just went. Got to work, got busy. Before you know it, it's the end of the day. Gets home from work tired, hungry, but too tired to eat. So he sleeps. And he wakes up to the adhan of al-Maghrib. Did he fast? No. Didn't eat all day. Was he fasting? No. Can he say, you know what? I fasted today, alhamdulillah. Can he do that? No, because he didn't have the intention. It's important for us to understand, brothers and sisters, that every act of worship, every ibadah has arkan. It has certain essential ingredients that without them, or without any one of them, that act of worship will not be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the case of fasting, it has ruknan. It has two essential pillars. The first one is an imsak, to abstain from those things that we're required to abstain from. The top three of them being al-akal, food, shurb, drink, wal-jima', intimacy. So that's the first rukn, but it's not the only rukn. Because this gentleman who went and didn't eat all day, he had the first rukn, right? Al-imsak. But the second rukn is a niyyah. You have to abstain with the intention of abstaining. It can't just be by accident, by happenstance, which is what happened in the example that we gave. And this is something which the scholars are agreed upon, as mentioned by Ibn Qudama rahimahullah ta'ala, that there can be no fasting without willful intent. You have to intend to fast. So this is something agreed upon by the scholars. Where they differ is this issue of tabyit and niyyah. At what point does the person have to intend to fast? You guys see that? So let's take that scenario again. This man wakes up, and as I said, he woke up a little late. There was no time to eat. went off to work. At noon, he's still working, and he hasn't eaten anything, and he says, you know what? I might as well fast. So at that point, he resolves himself. He intends to make this a day of fasting. Can he do that or not? This is where the difference of opinion falls. And the scholars of Islam, they differ between al-fard wal-nafl. They differ between the obligatory fast and the non-obligatory fast. But what we find from the hadith of Hafsa, radiallahu anha, first of all, let's talk about the hadith in jihat al-riwayah, from the point of view of narration. The way the hadith is narrated by Ibn Hajr rahimahullah ta'ala is that it is a statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But in reality, the scholars of Islam, when they took a closer look at this hadith, they determined that it's actually the statement of who? Hafsa. It's actually a statement we call mawquf. It's actually something that Hafsa said and not something that the Prophet said. But to be honest, that doesn't affect the hujjiyah, the validity and the precedent established by the narration of Hafsa. Why? Because what she said is not something that she could say based upon her own ijtihad, her own deduction or deductive reasoning. She had to have heard it from who? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is what we call mawquf bi hukm al-rafa. It's something that the companion said, but it has the ruling, it's treated, it's acted upon as if the Prophet said it. Add to that her brother Ibn Umar said the exact same thing. So we have two companions of Rasulullah saying that there's no siyam if a person did not have the intention at some point in the night. And there's a common qaida in usul al-fiqh that says that if a companion says something, washtahar, their statement becomes common knowledge. Other people know about it. And we don't have any contending view. We don't have another companion who says, that companion is mistaken. I heard something else. Then that statement is what? Is right, is accepted, and should be acted upon. Because the companions will not agree or accept batil. They won't accept something which is false or incorrect or wrong. So a person has to have the intention by night, according to Hafsa radiallahu anha and Ibn Umar radiallahu anh. And this was the opinion adopted by Imam Malik, Al-Shafi'i, and Ahmed, that there has to be an intention at some point in the night. And some point in the night means what? Before Fajr. Okay? And when we say intention, doesn't mean that a person has to say something specifically. But rather, they have to just resolve. And that resolve is something which we can realize that we have it by certain actions that we do. A person comes back from the masjid, from Salatul Tarawih, gets home, and he says, you know what? I want my wife to make me a steak for breakfast. But if I wait until I get up to take out the steak, it won't be thawed. So he takes out the steak from the freezer and leaves it out to thaw overnight and goes to sleep. That action is an indication of what? The intention to fast, because that's the intention is to what? To make the steak for a suhoor. You guys see that? A person sets his alarm clock to wake up for a suhoor. That action is an indication of what? The niyyah is there. So he doesn't have to say anything. But his actions and his resolve inside are what will determine if he really has this niyyah. And as long as he has that niyyah at some point in the night, at some point before al-fajr, then he has what? Fulfilled what is required. And these scholars who hold this opinion that you have to at some point in the night have the intention, they base it upon the general principle that what we're required to do is we're required to fast the entire month without exception. And as we said, fasting is ruknan, it's two essential parts, abstaining and having what? The intention. So you have to abstain and have the intention for the whole month. And if you were to wake up without the intention and then decide or intend at noon, then there's a what? There's a 4-hour or 5-hour or 6-hour period where you didn't have what? You didn't have the niyyah. And that period, you really weren't what? You really weren't fasting. You guys see that? And so for this reason, they say you have to have the niyyah by night, because of the principle and because of the statement of Ibn Umar and Hafsa, radiallahu anhuma. The one dissenter is Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah ta'ala. He says you don't have to have the intention necessarily, and he based it upon that hadith that we mentioned last Wednesday, the hadith of Salama ibn al-Aqwa. The hadith of Salama ibn al-Aqwa, which talks about the legislation of the fasting of Ashura, where the Prophet sent a proclaimer to go around the town in the middle of the day to tell people, if you've already eaten, don't eat anything else, fast the rest of the day. And if you haven't eaten, then continue fasting, because today is Ashura. But the problem with using that hadith to support the fact that you don't have to have tabyit al-niyyah is that the hadith is muhtamal. The hadith is open to what? Multiple interpretations, and the scholars of Islam have said, Al-Dalil, إذا تطرق إليه احتمال بطل الاستدلال به. That if there's two ways you can interpret it. So for example, when the Prophet went around and told the people to fast, it's possible that they knew it was wajib, but they just didn't know that it was that what? That day. And in that case, they would be what? Munshi'ina al-niyya min dhalik al-waqt. They would be initiating the intention from that time. It's also possible that they didn't know what? It was wajib. And that would change the whole scenario. And so for that reason, we say the correct opinion is that you have to have this tabyit al-niyyah, you have to have the intention, because of the statement of Ibn Umar and Hafsa, and also the qa'idah that we have to fast the entire month. And fasting is what? Is an imsak. It is withholding from eating, abstaining from eating and drinking, etc. And doing that with the intention. The second issue related to this is a nafil. What if a person wanted to fast a day outside of Ramadan? A voluntary fast. Does that person have to have the intention by night? No. It appears that he doesn't. And that's because of the hadith number 533. And Aisha radiallahu anha قالت دخل علي النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ذات يوم فقال هل عندكم شيء؟ قلنا لا. قال فإني إذا صائم. وأتانا ثم أتانا يوما آخر فقلنا أهدي لنا حيس فقال أرنيه فلقد أصبحت صائما فأكل. So in this hadith, the Prophet, Aisha, she said, the Prophet ﷺ came to visit me one day and asked, do you have anything to eat? I said, no. He said, then I am fasting. Gives the impression that what? Ansha an-niyyah. That at that point he said, well, there's nothing to eat, I might as well fast. Then he came to me another day and I said I had been given a present of some haste. He said, show it to me. For I had began the day fasting. Then he what? He ate. So this hadith gives the impression, gives every indication that when it comes to Sawm al-Nafil, it comes to the non-obligatory fast, a person, as long as sometime in the day, the person makes the intention, he can intend to fast. Okay? If someone were to say, but the hadith of Aisha is muhtamal aydan, it's also something which is open to interpretations. Because when the Prophet said, فَإِنِّي إِذًا صَائِمٌ, it could mean, now I am making that intention. Or I already had the intention. But if you had something to eat, I was going to eat. But since you don't have anything to eat, أَنَا مُسْتَأْنِفٌ, I'm continuing my fast. You guys see that? But we respond to that by saying that ihtimal is there, but the ihtimal is cleared up. The interpretations are clarified by fatawa sahaba, by the verdicts of the sahaba, the companions, among them Ibn Abbas, who basically told us that it's okay when you're fasting a voluntary fast to make the intention during any time of the day. So in the case of that scenario that we said earlier, if that guy was on his way home from work and he said, it's 4 or 5 o'clock in the p.m., I'm going to make an asr and nap, and I'm just going to make my niyyah to fast. Can he do that? Sure. Yes, he can do that. Okay. With that, there's one other thing that's important to mention from this last hadith, the hadith of Aisha, is it also teaches us, it gives an ishara, that as-sa'im sawma naflin amiru nafsihi. That the person who is fasting a voluntary fast is in charge of himself. Meaning, he can continue fasting, or he can also do what? He can break his fast. Because the Prophet ﷺ was fasting, and then when the food was present, he went ahead and broke his fast and didn't continue it. So a person should not feel, if he's fasting and it becomes difficult for him, he shouldn't feel a sense of haraj, that it wouldn't be right for me to break my fast, so I have to push through. No, if he's tired of fasting, or if he's invited by someone, and he doesn't want to turn down the invitation, he can go, he can partake, and he can break his fast. And he doesn't have to make up that day. From here we go to ahadith numbers 534, 535, 536. And these ahadith, they deal with the sunan. They deal with some of the mukammilat, some of the aspects of fasting which will make our fast more complete and more rewardable. And this is important, especially as we are about to enter into Ramadan. We want to get the maximum reward out of our fast. We don't want to just do the bare minimum. We want to do more. And so we get more reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this section is important because it will teach us some of the things that we should do, make it a point to do every day, to get more reward out of our fasts. So the first hadith, 534, it reads, عن سهل ابن سعد رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال لا يزال الناس بخير ما عجلوا الفطر متفق عليه. So this is the hadith of Sa'd ibn Sa'd al-Sa'idi rahimahullah ta'ala, radiallahu anhu, who said that Allah's Messenger said, people will continue to be all right as long as they hasten the breaking of the fast. And this hadith is agreed upon by Bulughul, Muslim. So that's the first narration, the first riwayah. There's another riwayah that Ibn Hajar brings, but that riwayah that says, أَحَبُّ عِبَادِي إِلَيَّ أَعْجَدُهُمْ فِطْرًا, that the most beloved slave to me in my slaves is the one who hastens in the breaking of the fast. That second riwayah is not authentic. So it's important, we won't be commenting on that because that second riwayah is not authentic. But the first riwayah, the one collected by Bulughul Muslim, it teaches us a very important point, and that is istihbab ta'jil al-fitr. That when it comes time to break your fast, you should do what? You should break your fast. You shouldn't delay. Some people, they hear the adhan and they go outside and they look. And it still looks maybe like a little light. They don't see the sun, but to them it looks a little light. So they what? They wait. They wait until it gets dark outside. And then they find the what? They break their fast. The Prophet saying, no, you shouldn't do that. The Prophet is saying, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that it is a sign of goodness in the ummah when the people follow the sunnah. They follow the sunnah, they don't follow some imagined precaution in their own minds, thinking that somehow they're going to be more pious than Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and what he has taught us. The adhan is called, and you have no reason to doubt that the sun has set. You do what? You break your fast. But ثم بعد ذلك hadith number 535 is the hadith of Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم تسحروا فإن في السحور بركة. He said, take a meal just before dawn, for there is a blessing in suhoor, taking a meal at that time. And it's also agreed upon by Bukhari and Muslim. So this hadith, it teaches us that taking a meal before Fajr is mustahab. It's highly recommended for us to take a meal, to eat something. It could even be something small, but to do this before Salat al-Fajr. And it's not good to just omit this meal. Some people feel like, I don't need suhoor to fast. Or I like to sleep in. Right? I want to sleep right up until the time for Fajr. So I'm not going to eat suhoor. We shouldn't do that. The Prophet is telling us that it's what? It's highly recommended to fast. Now if you notice in the hadith, he said tasahharu. And this is actually a command from the Prophet. He said, take this meal. And typically when the Prophet commands us to do something, we consider that thing wajib. You have to do it. But there's a sarif, there's an indication that the Prophet didn't intend to obligate, but rather intend to encourage, and that is the ijma', the collective agreement of the scholars that the Prophet intended to encourage. And that ijma' was, it is hakahu Ibn al-Mundhir. It was conveyed to us by Ibn al-Mundhir rahimahullahu ta'ala. Now there's a mas'ala here, there's an issue here, that the Prophet said, فَإِنَّ فِي السُّحُورِ بَرَكَةً. There is some blessing in the suhoor. What is the blessing in the suhoor? Well, the blessing is twofold, and one angle of blessing comes to us from a nas, min jihat nas, from the point of a text that the Prophet said, and the other angle of blessing comes to us from, it is ma'nawi. It is something that we can ascertain from just one, from common sense and intellect. So the one that is from the text is the hadith collected by Muslim on the authority of Amr ibn al-As, in which the Prophet ﷺ said, فَصْلُ مَا بَيْنَ صِيَامِنَا وَصِيَامِ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ أَكْلَتْ السُّهُورِ. He said the thing that separates between, or divides, or distinguishes our fast and the fast of the people of the book is this meal of what? A suhoor. And one of the things that the Prophet was very keen to do was always to establish a distinct identity, religious identity for the Muslims. That's why you find so many hadith where the Prophet prefaces whatever he's going to tell us to do by saying, خَالِفُ الْيَهُودَ وَالنَّصَارَى, خَالِفُ الْمَجُوسِ, خَالِفُ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. He says, he'll preface whatever he's going to say, whatever he's going to tell us to do, he'll say, be different from the Jews and Christians. Be different from the Jews and Christians. Be different from the fire worshippers. Be different from the polytheists. The Prophet wants the Muslims to have a distinct identity, religious identity. That the way we do things is different from the way they do things if we have a shared ritual. If we have a shared manner of dress, the Prophet would do what? He would change something about it to be distinguished. If they wear a certain type of sandals, the Prophet wore a different type of sandals. If they don't pray in their sandals, the Prophet would pray in his sandals to be different from them. And one of the ways he wants the Muslims to be different from the non-Muslims is by eating what? Making it a point to eat a suhoor, because when they fast, they don't eat a suhoor. That's one of the forms of barakah in the suhoor. The other form of barakah is obvious. Can anybody guess what that is? Huh? Ahsant. It makes you strong. It gives you the ability to get through the day, because if you don't eat suhoor, at some point you're going to run out of fuel. You run out of fuel. Is that not so? And the Prophet doesn't want you to run out of fuel. Doesn't want it to be a mashaqqa. Allah doesn't want fasting to be a mashaqqa, hardship. يريد الله بكم اليسر ولا يريد بكم العسر. Allah wants to make things easy for you, doesn't want to make them difficult, so eat what? Eat the suhoor. Right, 10b, there's a note here. When it came to al-iftar, breaking the fast, we said it's recommended that you hasten to break the fast, that you do it early. But when it comes to a suhoor, it's preferred that you do it what? Later. That you delay it as much as possible. Some people will come home from Tarawih, for example, and they'll eat, and then they'll sleep. And that'll be their suhoor. You can do that. But it's better to what? Delay the suhoor until what? Until close to Salat al-Fajr. And we know this because as some of the companions of Muhammad ﷺ, they narrated, like Zayd ibn Thabit, that they would eat suhoor with the Prophet ﷺ. And then after that, the Prophet would go out and pray. And they were asked, how much time was there between the adhan and the suhoor of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And they would answer, qadr 50 ayah. The length of time it would take for a person to recite 50 ayat. Surah Amma is 50 ayat. How long do you think it takes to recite Surah Amma, you guys think? If you're reciting just normal, Not too fast, not too slow. For amma. Okay, let's say 10 minutes. I think 10 minutes is it could take 10 minutes. So that means that the Prophet was making suhoor close to what? Close to Fajr. Not in the middle of the night or the first part of the night. طيب, hadith number 536. وعن سلمان ابن عامر الضبي رضي الله عنه تعالى عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: إذا أفطر أحدكم فليفطر على تمر فإن لم يجد فليفطر على ماء فإنه طهور. So in this hadith, we learn that there's something specific, a specific type of food or drink that we're encouraged to break our fast on. And is it obligatory? No. So if a person wanted to have a candy bar when they broke their fast, they could do that. If a person comes home and something very good is on the stove and they wanted to take a sampling of that to break their fast, they can do that. They haven't done anything haram. But again, we don't want to do the bare minimum. We want to get the maximum reward for our fasting. And the Prophet is telling us here that if we break our fast with a date, we'll get more reward than if we break our fast with anything else, if dates are present. So this tells us that it's recommended for us to break our fast with a date, if dates are present. And if they're not present, it's best to break your fast with what? Water. With water. And Ibn al-Qayyim, he mentions the hikmah behind the Prophet ﷺ recommending dates and then watering himself. If they're not present, recommending water. So he said that dates, after a person has been fasting, he says if a person eats something, the first thing they eat is something sweet. What that will do is make their stomach more prepared to accept what? To accept food. He said physiologically that eating something sweet, the first thing after fasting, makes the stomach more prepared to accept food. So there's a wisdom in that. He also said with respect to water, is that when a person is fasting, their kidneys become a little what? Dry. And the water does what? Gives moisture to the kidneys, and he said that helps with the process of digestion, believe it or not. So there's a wisdom in what the Prophet is prescribing. It's not just sunnah, and we get a reward for it. It's also healthy if we take this route. So we can't lose. We win from two angles. ثم بعد ذلك, Ibn Hajar, he stops here. He suffices himself with the mention of these three sunan. But these are not the only sunan for fasting, so we want to mention a few more that he didn't mention, or the hadith, he didn't cite hadith to support these in this section. So we'll mention three additional sunan that Ibn Hajar didn't mention. So one of them is a dua in the iftar. That when a fasting person breaks his fast, he's encouraged to make dua. Many people, when it comes time to break fast, or just before breaking fast, they'll busy themselves with whatever. And then when it comes time to break fast, they'll busy themselves with breaking fast. And then I've been in some masajid where people will come to attend Salat al-Maghrib, and they hear the adhan, they break their fast, and then they line up. They want to pray so that they can eat. And here, they're missing out on the reward that the Prophet mentioned in the hadith when he said, ثَلَاثَةٌ لَا يُرَدُّ دَعْوَتُهُمْ or لَا تُرَدُّ دَعْوَتُهُم. He said there are three individuals who their supplication, their dua, is not going to be rejected. He mentioned one of them, الصَّائِمْ حِينَ يُفْتِرُ. The fasting person, when he breaks his fast, his dua is going to be accepted. It's an opportunity for some. But some people miss out on the forsa because they're thinking about the wrong things. The food was not going to disappear. It's not going to go away. But this opportunity, the window of opportunity will do what? It will close. So seize the opportunity. You break your fast and then you make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for whatever it is you want to make dua for. The second sunnah that I want to mention is az-ziyada fi a'mal al-khair. We're highly recommended in Ramadan to do more and more good deeds, to exert ourselves in doing as much good as we can. So there are certain common good deeds that we typically do as Muslims anyway. We read Quran, we make dhikr, we make istighfar, we give charity. These are things we typically do, inshallah ta'ala. We should do even more of those in Ramadan. ويدل ذلك ما ثبت عند البخاري من حديث ابن عباس أنه قال كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أجود الناس وكان أجود ما يكون في رمضان. The Prophet ﷺ was the most generous of people. He would give you the shirt, literally the shirt off his back. But in Ramadan, he was even more generous. وكان جابر رضي الله عنه يقول ولا يكون يوم صومك ويوم فطرك سواء. He used to say, Jabir radiallahu anhu, the Sahabi, he used to say, don't let your days of fasting and your days of non-fasting be the same. There should be what? An increase in your ibadah, an increase in your worship and devotion and your striving in the days when you're fasting. طيب, ثم بعد ذلك, the third and final sunnah that we'll add is the Prophet encouraged us when we're fasting to observe a certain level of decorum and to control our anger and our emotions and not to let anything get to us as best as we can. Because typically what happens when you're fasting, you're a little tight, right? A little uptight, a little tense. Anything can do what? Can trigger you when you're fasting. The Prophet wants us to be mindful of this and not to let our emotions get the best of us and to remain in control of ourselves. So somebody may come and they may want to argue with us. So the Prophet gave us a sunnah, something that if we do it, we'll get more reward for our fasting. And that is if someone tries to argue with you or they insult you, you're supposed to say, Inni imru'un sa'im. As the Prophet said in the hadith, he said, إِذَا كَانَ يَوْمُ صَوْمِ أَحَدِكُمْ فَلَا يَلْفُظْ. If one of you is fasting, then let him not speak profanely. Let him not use foul language or talk about things which are inappropriate. وَلَا يَسْخَبْ. And don't let him argue with anyone. فَإِنْ شَاتَمَهُ أَحَدٌ أَوْ قَاتَلَهُ. So if someone insults him or tries to get into a fight with him, فَلْيَقُلْ إِنِّي إِمْرُؤٌ صَائِمٌ. Let him say, I'm fasting. Right, so these are three other sunnah that will add to what Ibn Hajar ta'ala he mentioned. The adhan is what time? Well, I don't want to be late like 9:07. 9:07. Okay, so we'll make sure we're done before then. Right, so now we're into another section where there are several hadith, numbers 538 through 545. Several hadith. And this section, Ibn Hajar ta'ala, he is talking about two things. Those things that if a Muslim does it, they expose their fast to Al-Bulughul. Things that if you do it, you put your fast at risk of being nullified. And also things that people think will nullify your fast, but in reality they don't nullify your fast. So he brings these hadith to clarify this for us. Rahimahullah ta'ala. So the first hadith is 538. And that is the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من لم يدع قول الزور والعمل به والجهل فليس لله حاجة في أن يدع طعامه وشرابه. So he said, if one does not abandon falsehood and action in accordance, if one does not abandon falsehood in word and deed, or foolishness, acts of foolishness, Allah has no need that he should abandon his food and drink. So there's a few things from this hadith. One is that the Prophet mentioned al-kadhib, or qawl al-zur, lying, speaking falsely, or acting falsely. He mentioned al-jahl, he mentioned behaving ignorantly. These things, are they right to do outside of Ramadan? No, they're not right to do inside Ramadan or outside of Ramadan while you're fasting or while you're not fasting. But what the Prophet is saying here is that they're even more wrong to do while you're fasting. It's even worse if you do these things while you are fasting. Now the Prophet said, فَلَيْسَ لِلَّهِ حَاجَةٌ فِي أَنْ يَدَعَ طَعَامَهُ وَشَرَابَهُ. Allah has no need for him to leave his food and drink. So should we understand from that Should we understand from that if the person was so pious and avoided all these things while he was fasting, that Allah would have a need then? Should we understand that? No. Does Allah have needs? Whether we're pious or we're impious, Allah has no needs for anything we do. So then what does the Prophet mean when he says, فَلَيْسَ لِلَّهِ حَاجَةٌ? Allah doesn't have a need regardless, so what does it mean? The scholars of Islam have interpreted this in two ways. The first way is they say that it is a kinaya. It is a euphemism, a metaphor, another way of saying siyamuhu kala siyam. His fasting is like what? It's like not fasting. It's like he hasn't even fasted. If this person does these things while he's fasting, it's like he's not fasting. Kinayatun an adam al-qubul. It's like the Prophet is saying his fast won't be accepted. The other scholars said no, his fast will be accepted in terms of what? An ijaz. So basically, when you do an act of worship, for example, you make salat, we just made salat al-maghrib. There are two things that you get from that salat. One of them is an ijaz. Basically, it's confirmed and written that you prayed as opposed to it being written that you didn't pray. You guys see that? But you're also looking to get a second thing, which is a thawab, a reward. Some level of reward from Allah, some level of good deeds from Allah, some amount of good deeds. So the second interpretation is that the person, he will get the ijaz. He'll get his box checked that he fasted. He doesn't have to make up that day. But the thawab he'll get will be what? Will be naqas. And he'll get some reward, but the reward he'll get will be nothing in comparison to the ithm, the sin that he'll get for doing these things while fasting. So that's the second interpretation of the scholar. Hadith number 539 is the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha. قالت كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقبل وهو صائم ويباشر وهو صائم ولكنه كان أملككم بإربه متفق عليه. So in this hadith, Aisha, she says the Prophet ﷺ used to kiss while he was fasting and fondle. He would hug and caress while he was fasting. But he was one among you who had the most control over his desires. So this hadith, it teaches us that al-qubla, that a man kissing his wife, a wife kissing her husband, is not a mufattir. It's not something that will break your fast, provided that it's not accompanied by an inzal. It's not accompanied by ejaculation, by something coming out as a result of the kissing. And this is something agreed upon by the scholars, as mentioned by Ibn Abd'Llah. So this is something agreed upon. A man can kiss his wife, a wife can kiss her husband, provided that nothing happens as a consequence of that. And this hadith is one evidence for that. Then after that there are three hadith which deal with the issue of al-hijama. Deal with the issue of cupping or bloodletting. I'm not going to read the hadith because of the time, but I do want to make 2 points about these three hadith about bloodletting. And that is that one, لا يصح القياس or لا يصح القياس التبرك بالدم على الحجامة. A lot of times people will say that donating blood and cupping are analogous to each other. So just like you can't get cupped while you're fasting, you can't donate blood while you're fasting. The fact of the matter is that in order for us to make qiyas, to make analogy, the illah, the reason or basis for the ruling has to be known. And two, the two things have to be similar. And both of those cases are not present. We don't know the illah of the prohibition of cupping is ta'abudiyya. Allah wants to be worshipped by people not cupping while they're fasting. And so we can't make an analogy between bloodletting and giving blood. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if we say you can't make an analogy between bloodletting and al-hijama, you can't make an analogy between at-tahleel and al-hijama. You guys know what tahleel is? Tahleel is when you just go and they take some samples of blood to run tests. Now the amount of blood that happens there is very small. So that will also not break your fast. So tabarruk bid-dam will not break your fast, and at-tahleel, taking blood samples, will not break your fast. Hadith number 543 is the hadith of Aisha, and the hadith is a weak hadith. It is a hadith of Aisha radiallahu anhu قالت أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم اكتحل في رمضان وهو صائم. That the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, he applied kuhl, that's like a liner in the eye, when he was fasting. Now this hadith is a weak hadith, but al-kuhl, particularly for women, who, I mean, we don't use it now. It's not common. Ahsant. Doesn't mean a man couldn't use it, but men just don't typically use it now. But women do use it, and they can use it in Ramadan because al-asl adam al-fitr, that the original rule when it comes to anything is that it doesn't break your fast. It's not the opposite. Everything breaks your fast unless you have proof that it doesn't. No, nothing breaks your fast unless we have proof that it does. You guys see that? So a person says, does burping break your fast? What would you say? No, because we need a dalil that burping breaks your fast. You guys see that? Person says, does swimming break your fast? Person goes for a swim. Does that break your fast? No, because al-asl adam al-fitr. The original rule is that nothing breaks your fast unless we have proof to the contrary. It's not the opposite. So a person says, can a woman wear kuhl? You say, yes, unless you have proof to the contrary. Al-bayyinatu ala al-mudda'i. The burden of proof will be on the claimant. So somebody says taking a swim breaks your fast, the burden of proof will be upon them to support that with some type of evidence. The next hadith is hadith number 544, and as a hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من نسي وهو صائم فأكل أو شرب فليتم صومه فإنما أطعمه الله وسقاه. So he said, radiallahu anhu, that the Messenger said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whoever forgets while fasting and eats or drinks, he should complete his fast, for Allah has fed him and given him drink. So a person is fasting and he's at work, and he feels thirsty, and he's busy doing so many things. He's got so many things in his head, swimming around his head. He passes by a water fountain and he takes a drink, and all of a sudden he realizes, oh, I'm fasting. Does he have to make up that day? The hadith of Rasulullah says, لا. إنما أطعمه الله وسقاه. Allah just what? Gave him a drink, gave him a pass, gave him something, and he should continue his fast. And this actual hadith is very beneficial because it gives us a qa'idah, a religious qa'idah. The scholars have taken from this hadith, and the qa'idah says, من نسي ففعل محظورا فلا شيء عليه. Whoever forgets, and as a result of his forgetting, he does something which he's prohibited from doing, but he did it out of forgetfulness, then he doesn't have to make amends. He doesn't have to make. He's not penalized for that. And this hadith is a proof for that. Is a qa'idah shar'iyya, and this hadith is a proof for that qa'idah. It's also important to, although Abu Hurairah mentioned al-akl wa shurb, he mentioned specifically food and drink, this qa'idah, this principle that he gave, is applicable to all of the mufakkirat. Everything that can break your fast, if you commit it nisyanan, if you commit it out of forgetfulness, your fast will not be broken. But we'll do one more and then we'll stop that is hadith number 545, and that is the hadith of Abu Hurairah. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من ذرعه القيء فلا قضاء عليه ومن استقاء فعليه القضاء رواه الخمسة. So he says, if one has a sudden attack of vomiting while fasting, no atonement is required of him. But if he vomits intentionally, he must make atonement. So there's two things here. There's a person who vomits intentionally. He makes himself vomit. And this is a muftir. This is something which will break your fast, ijma'an. The scholars are agreed that if a person makes himself vomit, his fast is broken. And the scholars are all agreed. Ibn al-Mundhir, he said, أجمعوا على إبطال صومي من استقاء عمدا. Ibn al-Mundhir, he said, the scholars are all unanimously agreed that the fast of the one who purposely vomits is broken. The second type of vomiting is the vomiting that occurs unintentionally, against your will. And that vomiting does not break or does not violate a person's fast. Because as we said, al-aslu adam al-naqd. Adam al-fitr. That the original rule is that nothing breaks your fast unless they have proof to the contrary. Now this hadith is disputed. But there are fatwa from the companions, among them Ibn Umar, which are in line with this statement or this hadith. And if we say the hadith is not authentic, then the evidence that we have is the ijma' regarding, or the unanimous agreement regarding intentional vomiting. And that leaves us with what? No statement, no hujjah regarding unintentional vomiting. And we go back to al-asl, we go back to the original rule of thumb, which is adam al-fitr, bidun dalil, or illa bidalil. So that being said, if a person vomits unintentionally, one of us is in Ramadan, may Allah not let this happen, but if we're fasting Ramadan and one of us is overcome by vomiting, we shouldn't think, oh, I lost this day. He didn't lose that day. Because vomiting unintentionally does not break your fast. And with that, we'll bring today's session to a close. May Allah bless you and reward you for coming. This is a Friday. And you guys came out on a Friday. May Allah reward you for that. I really, really mean it. May Allah reward you. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بارك الله فيك. جزاك الله خير.